December 19th, 1944. The Ardennes forest lay silent under a blanket of snow, broken only by the grinding of tank treads and the crunch of boots. Hauptmann Werner Schultz pressed his back against the frozen bark of an oak tree, his breath forming clouds that hung in the air like accusations. His Panzergrenadier unit had been on the move for 3 days, pushing west through Belgium, and they were exhausted. Low on fuel, lower on hope. Then he heard it, the distinctive whine of an engine, high-pitched and urgent, cutting through the morning stillness. American. It had to be. His men raised their rifles, tensing behind the snow-covered vehicles they'd captured the day before. Through the trees came a small olive-drab vehicle, bouncing over the rutted forest road with what seemed like reckless confidence. It skidded to a stop when the driver spotted the German position. The firefight lasted less than a minute. When the smoke cleared, 2 Americans lay dead in the snow, and the little vehicle sat there, engine still running, completely intact. Schultz approached it cautiously, his Walther drawn. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. He had seen these machines before, scattered across the battlefields of France, abandoned or destroyed. But this was the first one he'd examined up close while it still functioned. It was smaller than he'd imagined. Barely 11 feet long, no taller than his chest. The body was simple stamped steel, painted in flat olive drab. No curves, no elegance, just angular utility. 4 seats, no doors, a canvas top stretched over a minimal frame. The Americans called it a jeep. His men gathered around, rifles slung, curious despite their exhaustion. Obergefreiter Klaus Dietrich, a mechanic in civilian life, climbed into the driver's seat without asking permission. He studied the dashboard, the simple gauges, the minimal controls. He pressed the clutch, shifted into first gear, and let out the clutch. The jeep rolled forward smoothly, its tires gripping the snow-covered ground with surprising confidence. He circled the clearing twice, then stopped beside Schultz. "It's so simple, Herr Hauptmann," Dietrich said, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. "Like a child's toy." "But it moves." Schultz said nothing. He was thinking of the Kubelwagen they'd left behind 2 kilometers back, its engine seized from cold, its differential cracked from strain. They'd been driving it hard for weeks, pushing it beyond its limits, and it had finally given up near a burned-out farmhouse. They'd stripped it of anything useful and kept moving on foot. Now here was this American machine, looking fragile, almost comical in its plainness. Yet it ran, more than ran. It idled smoothly, its engine notes steady and even. No rattling, no grinding, no ominous clicking that promised imminent failure. Schultz ordered his men to push their own vehicles off the road and transfer what supplies they could into the jeep. While they worked, Dietrich lifted the hood. What he saw made him stop. The engine sat there, exposed and honest. An inline 4-cylinder block, cast iron, simple as a farm tractor's, a flathead design, nothing sophisticated, nothing that required special tools or exotic parts. The valve covers were held on with basic bolts. The carburetor was a single-barrel unit, uncomplicated. Everything was accessible. Everything looked like it had been designed to be fixed in the field by men with dirty hands and limited time. "Mein Gott," Dietrich whispered. One of the other soldiers, a Gefreiter named Hans Weber, leaned in beside him. Weber had worked in his father's machine shop in Hamburg before the war. He'd rebuilt motorcycle engines, repaired truck differentials, understood machinery the way some men understood music. He stared at the jeep's engine for a long moment, then reached out and touched the valve cover as if to confirm it was real. "This is American engineering?" Weber asked. "This is what they use to supply an army?" Dietrich nodded, slowly. "The cylinder head is integral with the block, no separate piece to crack under stress. Look at the cooling system, simple water passages, nothing complex. And this, he tapped the carburetor, this could be rebuilt with spare parts from any auto shop in the world, maybe even made from scratch if you had a lathe and time. Schultz listened to their technical discussion with growing unease. He'd been raised on stories of German engineering superiority, the precision, the complexity, the sophisticated solutions to difficult problems. That's what made German machines great, he'd been told. That's why the Reich would triumph. Quality over quantity, engineering genius over mass production. Yet here in his hands was a machine that violated every principle he'd been taught. It was simple where German vehicles were complex. It was crude where they were refined. It used basic materials where they used specialized alloys. And it worked. Not just worked, it thrived. They loaded the jeep with ammunition crates, ration boxes, 2 wounded men who could barely walk, and their remaining fuel cans. Dietrich estimated they'd packed close to 800 pounds into the vehicle. He started the engine again, engaged the clutch, and the jeep moved forward without complaint. For the next 6 hours, they drove west through the Ardennes. The jeep bounced over frozen ruts that would have shattered the suspension on most civilian vehicles. It forded a half-frozen stream, water splashing over the hood, and emerged on the other side, still running. When they encountered a steep, snow-covered hill, Dietrich shifted into low gear, and the jeep climbed it without hesitation, its 4-wheel drive system distributing power to all wheels with mechanical simplicity. By late afternoon, they reached a German supply depot, where a signals officer told them the offensive was stalling. Fuel shortages, vehicle breakdowns. The cold was killing their machines faster than American artillery. Schultz looked at the captured jeep sitting in the motor pool, surrounded by disabled German vehicles, and felt something shift in his understanding of the war. That evening, while his men ate and rested, Schultz found Dietrich and Weber examining the jeep in detail. They'd removed the seats, inspected the frame, traced the fuel lines, studied the electrical system. A small crowd of German soldiers had gathered to watch, mechanics and drivers who'd spent the last 3 years fighting their own vehicles as much as the enemy. "Tell me what you've found," Schultz said. Dietrich straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag. His face was serious. "Herr Hauptmann, this vehicle was designed by people who understand war. Not the glory of war, not the theory of war, but the reality of it. Every choice they made was about keeping it running under the worst possible conditions." He pointed to various components as he spoke. "The frame is simple ladder construction, like a truck. If it bends, you can straighten it with basic tools. The body panels are flat stamped steel, completely replaceable. Nothing is welded that doesn't need to be. The engine is designed to run on low-grade fuel. The electrical system uses a 24-volt generator that charges even at idle. The carburetor has a hand primer for cold starts. Every part is standardized, interchangeable." Weber interrupted, his voice tight with frustration. "And look at this, the transmission. It's a 3-speed with a 2-speed transfer case. That gives 6 forward gears effectively, plus reverse. But it's all simple dog-clutch engagement, nothing delicate. A trained driver can shift without the clutch if needed. The whole thing can be rebuilt in an afternoon with hand tools." Schultz studied their faces. Both men looked disturbed, as if they'd discovered something they wished they hadn't. "Go on," he said quietly. Dietrich gestured at the jeep with something approaching reverence. "This machine was not designed to be the best, Herr Hauptmann. It was designed to be good enough, simple enough, and cheap enough to produce in quantities we cannot imagine. And that may be more dangerous than any Tiger tank or 88mm gun." The words hung in the cold air. Around them, disabled Kubelwagens and SDKFED's vehicles sat in various states of disrepair, waiting for parts that might never come, waiting for mechanics with specialized knowledge, waiting for precision components manufactured in factories that were now being bombed around the clock. The jeep sat among them like a rebuke, its engine ticking as it cooled, ready to start again at a moment's notice. Later that night, Schultz wrote in his journal by candlelight, his fingers stiff from cold. He described the jeep, its capabilities, its simplicity. Then he wrote something that surprised him as the words formed. We have been building cathedrals while the Americans built factories. We have been crafting masterpieces while they stamped out tools. And now I fear we are learning the difference between what is beautiful and what is necessary. The next morning brought orders to abandon the offensive and fall back. Fuel shortages had crippled the advance. Schultz's unit retreated east, back through the forests they'd captured days before. They drove the captured jeep because their own vehicles had failed. As they passed burned-out German trucks and abandoned tanks, Schultz thought about production numbers, about replacement parts, about the industrial capacity required to keep an army mobile. Germany had produced roughly 50,000 Kubelwagens during the entire war. Quality vehicles, certainly. Comfortable, fuel-efficient, beloved by their crews. But 50,000. The intelligence reports said America had built over 600,000 jeeps. 600,000. More than 12 times as many. And they were still building them, rolling off assembly lines in Toledo and Detroit at a rate Germany couldn't match even if every factory worked at full capacity. The mathematics were devastating. For every German light vehicle produced, America made 12. And those American vehicles, those simple, crude, unsophisticated machines, they just kept running. Dietrich drove them through a small Belgian town that had been liberated, then recaptured, then liberated again. The walls were pockmarked with bullet holes. Abandoned vehicles lined the streets, German and American both. But Schultz noticed something. The German vehicles looked catastrophically broken, frames twisted, engines torn apart. The American vehicles looked merely stuck or damaged, as if they'd been abandoned not because they'd failed, but because their crews had been forced to leave them. They passed one American jeep that had clearly been hit by shrapnel. The hood was punctured, the windshield shattered, but someone had written in chalk on the side, "Broke down 3 times, fixed 3 times, still runs." It was dated 2 months earlier. The jeep was still there, sitting by the roadside, and when Weber went to investigate out of professional curiosity, he found the engine would turn over if you hot-wired it. The battery was dead, that was all. "They just left it," Weber said, his voice hollow, "like it doesn't matter, like they have so many they can afford to abandon one that still functions." Schultz remembered something an intelligence officer had told him months ago, back when the war still seemed winnable. The officer had been analyzing American industrial reports and had gone pale reading the numbers. "They're producing vehicles faster than we can destroy them," he'd said. Last month, American factories built more trucks than Germany produced in all of 1943. And they're accelerating. No one had believed it then. It seemed impossible, propaganda perhaps. But here, driving this captured jeep through the wreckage of Germany's last offensive, Schultz believed it. He believed it because he could feel it in his hands, the steering wheel solid and responsive, the engine pulling steadily even after 3 days of hard use, the gearbox shifting smoothly despite being operated by a driver who'd never seen the machine before this week. They reached a crossroads where a German supply convoy sat, empty. The trucks had run out of fuel 20 kilometers from any depot. The drivers stood around smoking, waiting for fuel that probably wouldn't come. Schultz stopped the jeep, and several of the German drivers walked over to examine it. One of them, an Unteroffizier with a weather-beaten face, circled the vehicle slowly. "American?" he asked. Schultz nodded. The Unteroffizier laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Of course it is. These things are everywhere now. You know what our drivers call them? Amerikanische Esel, American donkeys. Because they're small, they're stubborn, and they never quit." Another driver spoke up. "I was in France. When we retreated from Normandy, the Americans followed us so fast we couldn't believe it. We'd blow a bridge, they'd have it repaired in hours. We'd crater a road, they'd fill it by morning. And these jeeps, they were everywhere. Carrying supplies forward, evacuating wounded back, stringing telephone wire, towing guns, scouting ahead. Sometimes I thought there were more jeeps than soldiers." Schultz thought about that image. An army so mobile, so mechanized, that its vehicles outnumbered its men. It seemed absurd, wasteful even. Yet here they were, German soldiers on foot, or huddled in broken vehicles, while their enemies drove past on machines they could barely keep track of. "Can I look at the engine?" the Unteroffizier asked. Dietrich opened the hood, and the supply convoy drivers gathered around like students at a lecture. They asked questions about maintenance, about parts availability, about field repairs. Dietrich answered honestly, describing what he'd learned. "Everything is designed for replacement, not repair," he explained. "You don't rebuild a carburetor, you swap it out. You don't patch a radiator, you install a new one. They've standardized every component. Any Jeep can donate parts to any other Jeep, and I've heard, though I don't know if it's true, that American supply depots carry complete replacement engines. You don't rebuild, you just exchange." One of the drivers shook his head in disbelief. "That's impossible. Engines are too expensive, too complex. You can't just throw them away." But even as he said it, his voice carried doubt. They'd all seen enough by now to know that American logistics operated on principles that seemed insane by German standards. Schultz remembered a captured American quartermaster manual someone had shown him. It listed replacement intervals for vehicle components, schedules for preventive maintenance, stocks of spare parts measured in percentages of vehicles in service. The Americans, it seemed, had calculated the mean time between failures for every component on the Jeep and stocked accordingly. They expected things to break. They planned for it. They built an entire supply system around the assumption that machines would fail and needed to be repaired or replaced quickly. Germany, meanwhile, had built vehicles that weren't supposed to break, and when they did, the replacement parts didn't exist in sufficient quantities. Quality versus quantity, precision versus pragmatism. It was the story of the entire war, written in steel and oil and rubber. As the drivers drifted back to their stranded trucks, Schultz climbed back into the Jeep. They drove east through the lengthening shadows, passing more wreckage, more abandoned vehicles, more signs of a Wehrmacht that was bleeding machines faster than it could replace them. That night, they camped in a forest clearing. Dietrich performed routine maintenance on the Jeep by flashlight, checking oil levels, inspecting belts, tightening bolts. The work took 30 minutes. Schultz watched him and thought about the Kübelwagen they'd abandoned. To properly service, it required specialized tools, training, knowledge. The Jeep required a wrench and common sense. "Herr Hauptmann," Weber said quietly, sitting down beside him. "I've been thinking about what we found today." Schultz waited. Weber chose his words carefully. "In Hamburg, before the war, we prided ourselves on craftsmanship. My father could build anything, fix anything. He taught me that quality was what mattered. Make it right, make it to last, never compromise." He paused, staring at the Jeep. "But this machine, it's taught me something else. Sometimes quality isn't about perfection. Sometimes it's about fitness for purpose. The Americans didn't build the best light vehicle. They built a light vehicle that could be produced in massive numbers, maintained by average mechanics, and operated by soldiers with minimal training. And that might be more valuable than perfection." Schultz nodded slowly. He'd been thinking similar thoughts but hadn't wanted to voice them. To do so felt like betrayal, like admitting that everything they'd been taught was wrong, yet the evidence surrounded them. German engineering had produced magnificent machines, Panthers and Tigers and King Tigers, each one a masterpiece of armor and firepower. But those masterpieces broke down, used too much fuel, required specialist mechanics, and took months to produce. The Americans had produced Shermans, inferior in armor and gun, but available in overwhelming numbers. And these Jeeps, simple and crude, but everywhere, always. By dawn, they were moving again. The Jeep carried them another 80 kilometers before they reached a German armor depot where Schultz was ordered to report. He left Dietrich and Weber with the vehicle and climbed the stairs to a command bunker where officers studied maps with increasing desperation. A colonel listened to Schultz's report about the state of the offensive, then asked about the Jeep. "You've been driving it for several days?" Schultz confirmed this. The colonel gestured to a corner of the bunker where another American Jeep sat, partially disassembled. "We've been studying these machines, trying to understand them. The reports from the front are, well, they're concerning. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this." He pulled out a folder and showed Schultz a series of intelligence summaries. American vehicle production numbers, maintenance records captured from occupied depots, interviews with prisoners who'd worked in motor pools. "They're building these faster than we can count them," the colonel said. "And here's what troubles me most. The Americans don't care about them. They're disposable in their eyes. A broken Jeep is an inconvenience, not a crisis. They abandon them, they cannibalize them, they drive them until they fail, then get another one." He closed the folder and looked at Schultz. "That's the advantage of simplicity, Hauptmann. When something is simple and cheap, you can afford to use it without fear. Our Kübelwagens are good vehicles, excellent vehicles, but we can't afford to lose them. Every one that breaks down is a loss we feel. The Americans lose 100 Jeeps and don't notice." Schultz thought about this as he walked back to where his men waited. The Jeep sat there, mud-spattered and dented, looking like it had been through a war. Because it had, and it was still ready to go again. The irony was sharp. Germany had spent years perfecting its military vehicles, refining designs, improving components, seeking excellence, and in doing so, they'd created machines that were excellent but irreplaceable. America had done the opposite. They'd accepted good enough and focused on making good enough available in unlimited quantities. 3 weeks later, Schultz's unit had fallen back another 100 kilometers. The Jeep was still with them. It had survived 2 strafing runs by American fighters, a minor collision with a tree during a night retreat, and constant use over roads that barely deserved the name. Dietrich had performed basic maintenance twice, changing the oil using captured American supplies and replacing a broken fan belt with one he'd fashioned from a piece of rubber hosing. The Jeep kept running. By contrast, they'd lost 4 more Kübelwagens to mechanical failures. One had thrown a rod after being pushed too hard up a mountain pass. Another's differential had disintegrated on frozen ground. A third had simply refused to start one morning, its electrical system defeated by moisture and cold. The fourth had caught fire after shrapnel severed a fuel line, the entire vehicle consumed in minutes. Each loss hurt. Each loss reduced their mobility, their effectiveness, their chances of survival. Schultz began keeping detailed notes about the Jeep's performance, not because headquarters had asked, but because he needed to understand. He recorded fuel consumption, approximately 20 miles per gallon under combat conditions. He noted that the vehicle could carry 5 men comfortably, or 3 men plus significant cargo. He documented its performance in snow, mud, ice, and rubble. Every day, the notes accumulated, a testament to persistent reliability. One entry, dated January 15, 1945, read, "Encountered American convoy today. Counted 63 Jeeps in 30 minutes. 63. We passed 2 disabled Kübelwagens in the same stretch of road. The Americans move like water, flowing around obstacles. We move like soldiers, one careful step at a time. This cannot be sustained." Weber had continued his mechanical analysis, driven by professional curiosity that bordered on obsession. He'd befriended a captured American mechanic, a corporal from Michigan who'd worked in a Ford plant before the war. Through careful questioning, filtered through a translator, Weber learned things that disturbed him profoundly. The Jeep, the corporal explained, had been designed in 1940 by committee, not by genius engineers working in isolation, but by a group including military officers, automotive engineers, and manufacturing experts. They'd taken an existing prototype from a small company called Bantam, improved it, and handed the design to Willys and Ford with instructions to produce it in massive quantities. The entire design process, from concept to production, took less than 18 months. 18 months. Weber thought about German vehicle development, the years of testing and refinement, the constant pursuit of marginal improvements. The Americans had skipped all that. They'd defined minimum requirements, built to those requirements, and started production. Good enough, fast enough, cheap enough. Everything else was secondary. The American corporal had laughed when Weber asked about quality control. "Sure, we got quality control," he'd said through the translator. "But the point ain't perfection. Point is getting 'em out the door. If something's wrong, we fix it in the field. If we can't fix it, we replace it. We got plenty more where that came from." Plenty more. Those two words echoed in Weber's mind. Germany didn't have plenty more. Germany had scarcity, rationing, desperate measures. Every vehicle mattered, every loss stung. The Americans operated in a world of abundance that seemed almost obscene. They could afford to be wasteful because waste was built into their calculations. They overproduced, overstocked, oversupplied, and somehow this excess was their strength. By February, Schultz's unit was down to 30 men and the captured jeep. They'd lost contact with higher command. Communications had collapsed, supply lines were severed, and they were essentially on their own, moving east toward Germany through a landscape of defeat. The jeep carried their wounded, their remaining ammunition, and their dwindling hope. They passed through a destroyed German motor pool, and what Schultz saw there crystallized everything he'd been thinking. Dozens of vehicles sat in various states of disassembly. Kubelwagons with their engines removed, waiting for replacement parts. Opel trucks with cracked engine blocks. SDKFZ half-tracks cannibalized for components. The mechanics had simply abandoned the site, taking whatever tools they could carry, leaving the rest to rust. Dietrich walked among the wrecks like a man touring a cemetery. He stopped beside a Kubelwagen that looked almost intact and opened its hood out of habit. The engine was missing critical components: distributor, carburetor, fuel pump, all removed, presumably to keep other vehicles running. This was German logistics in 1945, robbing Peter to pay Paul, stretching resources that had already snapped. "You know what's funny, Herr Hauptmann?" Dietrich said, not sounding amused. "This Kubelwagen was probably a better vehicle than the Jeep when it was new, more comfortable, better fuel economy, decent performance, but it doesn't matter now. Quality doesn't matter when you can't get parts. Comfort doesn't matter when the vehicle doesn't run. All that matters is whether it works and whether you can keep it working." They drove on, the Jeep's engine note steady and almost comforting in its simplicity. Schultz thought about the pre-war years, the propaganda films showing German automotive excellence, the Autobahn system, the promise of motorization for everyone. Deutschland über alles, Germany above all. But that superiority had been built on assumptions of limited war, short campaigns, decisive victories. No one had planned for a war of attrition, a grinding contest of industrial capacity and resource management. In early March, they encountered a column of German prisoners being marched west by American guards. Schultz's unit was allowed to pass after showing their identification papers. As they drove by in the captured jeep, Schultz made eye contact with a German colonel among the prisoners. The colonel stared at the jeep, then at Schultz, his face a mask of exhaustion and something else. Recognition, perhaps. Understanding. The look of a man who'd finally grasped a truth he'd been avoiding. That night, Schultz wrote what would be his final journal entry about the jeep. "We believed our engineering was superior because it was complex, refined, advanced. We never understood that in war, superiority means different things. It means availability. It means maintainability. It means the ability to absorb losses and continue fighting. The Americans understood this. They built a vehicle that could be manufactured by the thousands, repaired by anyone, and operated by soldiers with minimal training. We built vehicles that required specialists to maintain and months to produce. They chose quantity with adequate quality. We chose quality without adequate quantity. The mathematics of this choice are now written across Europe in burning vehicles and broken armies." By April, Germany was collapsing. Schultz's unit had disintegrated. Most men either captured, killed, or simply vanished into the chaos. He, Dietrich and Weber drove the jeep east, trying to reach what remained of German-held territory. The vehicle had carried them over 1,500 kilometers, through some of the harshest conditions imaginable, and it was still running. They were stopped at an American roadblock on April 22nd. The war was clearly over, though no one had officially said so. An American lieutenant examined their papers, then walked around the jeep, noting the German markings they'd painted on it weeks earlier. "You boys have been driving this for a while," the lieutenant said in passable German. Schultz nodded. "Since December." The American laughed. "December? That's a good run. This one's probably got another 50,000 miles in it if you treat it right." He patted the hood like you'd pat a reliable horse. "We built 640,000 of these things. Can you believe that? 640,000. My dad worked at the Willys plant in Toledo. Said they were rolling off the line so fast they barely had time to test them. Just start it up, drive it onto a truck, ship it overseas. 640,000. Schultz had known the number intellectually, had seen it in intelligence reports. But hearing it from an American soldier, spoken casually, as if it were no great achievement, drove it home. Germany had produced 50,000 Kübelwagens and thought it a triumph of mobilization. America had produced over 12 times that many jeeps and considered it routine industrial output. They were taken to a prisoner of war processing center, and the jeep was driven away by an American private. Schultz watched it go, feeling an odd sense of loss. That machine had kept them alive when German vehicles had failed. It had outperformed, outlasted, and outsurvived everything the Wehrmacht could field against it. Not because it was better engineered, but because it was better suited to the reality of industrial warfare. In the POW camp, Schultz met other German officers who'd had similar experiences. A panzer commander who'd captured a jeep in France and used it until Germany surrendered. A logistics officer who'd analyzed captured American supply manuals and realized the scale of their production. A mechanic who'd rebuilt jeep engines and been shocked by how simple they were. They all shared the same disturbed recognition that they'd been fighting not just an army, but an industrial system that operated on principles they'd never understood. One evening, a former Wehrmacht engineer named Friedrich Becker gave an impromptu lecture to a group of prisoners. He'd worked on military vehicle development before the war and had strong opinions about what had gone wrong. "We over-engineered," he said bluntly. "We pursued perfection when we needed sufficiency. Look at the Jeep. It's not elegant. It's not sophisticated. Its engine is basic. Its transmission is simple. Its body is crude. But every design choice was made with mass production in mind." He drew diagrams in the dirt with a stick, illustrating his points. "The Americans understood something we didn't. In war, the victor isn't who builds the best weapon, but who can sustain production of adequate weapons long enough to overwhelm the enemy. They built a vehicle that was good enough for 90% of situations and could be produced in unlimited quantities. We built vehicles that were excellent for specific situations, but couldn't be produced fast enough to meet demand." Dietrich, sitting in the audience, raised his hand. "But surely quality matters. Surely there's value in building things properly?" Becker smiled sadly. "Of course quality matters. But there's a threshold beyond which additional quality becomes counterproductive. The Jeep met that threshold. It was reliable enough, capable enough, simple enough. Adding more features would have made it more expensive, slower to produce, harder to maintain. The Americans understood where that threshold was. We didn't." The conversation continued late into the night. German engineers and mechanics and officers picking apart their assumptions, their training, their entire approach to military equipment. It was painful, this self-examination. It required admitting that everything they'd been taught was not wrong exactly, but incomplete. They'd understood how to build excellent vehicles. They'd never understood how to build adequate vehicles in overwhelming numbers. Weber spoke up near the end. "I keep thinking about something the American corporal told me. He said in their factories, workers were trained to do one job, one specific task on the assembly line. They didn't need to understand the whole vehicle, just their piece of it. That way, they could train new workers in hours instead of months, and if someone left, they could be replaced immediately without disrupting production. He paused, organizing his thoughts. We couldn't do that. Our production required skilled craftsmen who understood entire systems. When we lost those men to the war effort, we couldn't replace them quickly. American production didn't depend on irreplaceable expertise. It was designed so that anyone could contribute. That's a different philosophy entirely. In the months that followed, as Germany lay in ruins and the world began counting the cost of the war, many former Wehrmacht officers found themselves replaying these conversations. They'd lost, that much was clear. But understanding why they'd lost, truly understanding the industrial and philosophical foundations of their defeat, required confronting uncomfortable truths about German assumptions of superiority. Years later, after being released from captivity, Werner Schultz returned to his home in Bavaria to find it largely intact. He worked as a technical translator, helping American companies establish operations in Germany. In 1952, he was hired by a German automotive firm that was beginning to recover from the war. His first assignment was to analyze American manufacturing techniques for possible adoption. He spent 6 months visiting American factories, including the Willys plant in Toledo, where Jeeps were still being produced for the Korean War. Standing on the factory floor, watching the assembly line move with mechanical precision, he finally understood what he'd been up against. This wasn't just a factory, it was a system designed for maximum output with minimum bottlenecks. Every tool, every worker position, every component delivery was optimized for continuous production. The plant manager, a friendly man named Robert Morrison, gave Schultz a tour personally. "We learned a lot during the war," Morrison explained. "Main thing we learned is that reliability doesn't come from making things perfect. It comes from making things simple enough that they can't go wrong in the first place. The Jeep succeeded because we removed everything that could fail, unnecessarily." He showed Schultz the current production model. It was almost identical to the wartime version. "We didn't need to change much," Morrison said. "The design was right the first time. Not perfect, but right. It did what it needed to do, and it could be built fast. That's what mattered." Schultz thought about the Kubelwagen, elegant in its efficiency, comfortable in its design, but ultimately insufficient in its numbers. He thought about all the German vehicles he'd seen broken and abandoned, victims not of inferior engineering but of insufficient industrial capacity to support them. And he thought about that captured Jeep that had carried him across hundreds of kilometers when German vehicles had failed. "You built 640,000 of these during the war," Schultz said quietly. Morrison nodded. "Give or take. Plus we sent them all over the world. Russia got about 50,000 through Lend-Lease. The British, the Free French, everybody. We probably built more Jeeps than Germany built total light vehicles during the entire war." The number was staggering, but Schultz believed it now. He'd seen the evidence, lived the consequences. "How?" he asked. "How do you sustain that kind of production?" Morrison smiled. "Simple designs, standardized processes, interchangeable parts, and an industrial base that wasn't being bombed. Plus, and this is important, we accepted that some percentage would fail. We overproduced deliberately. If we needed 10,000 Jeeps, we built 12,000. Redundancy was built into the system." Redundancy, excess, waste, even. But that waste was strategic, a buffer against uncertainty. Germany had operated on the assumption that every vehicle would be available, properly maintained, ready for use. America had assumed that vehicles would break, get lost, be destroyed, and had planned accordingly. One approach was optimistic. The other was realistic. Reality had won. In his report to the German automotive firm, Schultz recommended adopting several American practices: simplified designs, focus on manufacturability, acceptance of adequate rather than perfect solutions. Some of his colleagues resisted, arguing that German craftsmanship was superior and shouldn't be compromised. But the younger engineers, who'd seen the war's outcome, understood. Excellence that couldn't be produced in sufficient quantities was a luxury Germany could no longer afford. By the 1960s, when Schultz was nearing retirement, he occasionally lectured at technical universities. He always included a section on the Jeep, using it as a case study in design philosophy. This vehicle, he would say, showing photographs, represents a fundamental truth about engineering. The best solution is not always the most sophisticated one. Sometimes the best solution is the one that works reliably, can be produced quickly, and maintained easily. He'd tell his students about that day in December 1944 when his unit captured their first Jeep. How it had seemed crude and simple, how it had outperformed their own vehicles despite being inferior on paper. How it had taught him that engineering divorced from production reality was just theoretical exercise. We built beautiful vehicles, he'd say. The Americans built useful ones. In war, useful beats beautiful every time. Dietrich and Weber both survived the war as well. Dietrich returned to his trade as a mechanic and eventually opened his own garage in Munich. He specialized in American vehicles, finding them simpler to work on than their German counterparts. He kept a photograph on his shop wall, a faded image of the captured Jeep they'd driven through the Ardennes. Customers would ask about it, and he'd tell the story, always ending with the same conclusion. That machine taught me more about engineering than 4 years of technical school. It taught me that simplicity is its own form of genius. Weber went into manufacturing, working for several German automotive companies as they rebuilt after the war. He pushed for adoption of American assembly line techniques, often meeting resistance from craftsmen who saw such methods as degrading their skills. But gradually, the industry changed. German manufacturing incorporated American efficiency while maintaining German precision. The result was a new synthesis, combining the best of both approaches. In 1968, the German magazine Auto, Motor und Sport published a retrospective on World War II vehicles. They featured the Jeep prominently, interviewing veterans who'd captured and used them. The article's conclusion was stark. The Jeep represented American industrial philosophy made manifest: good enough, cheap enough, and available in unlimited quantities. Against such abundance, German quality was insufficient. The lesson remains relevant today. The article included quotes from former Wehrmacht soldiers, including Schultz. "We respected the Jeep," he'd said. "Some of us even loved it, though we couldn't admit that during the war. It saved lives, German lives, when our own vehicles failed us. That's a strange legacy, being defeated by a machine so simple you could almost rebuild it with hand tools. But that simplicity was its strength." Historians who later studied the war's industrial aspects consistently pointed to the Jeep as an example of how American manufacturing capacity overwhelmed German engineering excellence. Over 640,000 Jeeps produced between 1941 and 1945, roughly 51,000 Kübelwagens in the same period. The ratio told the story. Germany couldn't win a war of attrition against an enemy that could produce 12 times as many vehicles, while also outproducing them in tanks, aircraft, ships, and ammunition. The Jeep became legendary not because it was the best light vehicle ever designed, but because it was good enough and ubiquitous. American soldiers drove them through every theater of the war. They forded rivers, climbed mountains, crossed deserts, navigated jungles. They carried wounded, towed artillery, mounted machine guns, strung communication wire, and transported generals. When they broke down, which they did, they were fixed or replaced quickly because spare parts and replacement vehicles were always available. By contrast, German vehicles existed in a state of constant shortage. Every breakdown was a crisis. Every lost vehicle was a significant blow. This wasn't because German vehicles were inferior in design. It was because the industrial system supporting them couldn't sustain losses at the rate modern warfare imposed. The Jeep and its abundance represented American industrial power made visible, a daily reminder that the United States could produce faster than Germany could destroy. In 2005, the United States Postal Service issued a stamp commemorating the Jeep's role in World War II. The image showed a jeep with soldiers, mud-spattered and battle-worn. The caption read, "The vehicle that won the war." It was hyperbole, certainly. No single weapon or vehicle won the war, but if you asked veterans, American and German both, many would tell you the jeep was among the most important pieces of equipment the Allies fielded. Not the most powerful, not the most sophisticated, but the most useful. Werner Schultz died in 1976 at the age of 63. Among his effects, his family found his wartime journal, including those detailed notes about the captured jeep. They donated them to a military museum, where they remain archived today. Researchers studying the war's industrial aspects often cite his observations as valuable primary source material, a German officer's honest assessment of American production methods. His final journal entry about the jeep, written shortly before Germany's surrender, contained a sentence that captured the essential lesson. They built a machine that could be produced by the millions, operated by the thousands, and maintained by anyone. We built machines that required skilled workers to produce, trained drivers to operate, and specialist mechanics to maintain. Both approaches have merit. Only one could win a world war. The irony remains sharp decades later. Germany entered the war believing its technical sophistication would overcome numerical inferiority. The Americans proved that adequate technology produced in overwhelming numbers defeats excellent technology produced in limited quantities. The Jeep wasn't a better vehicle than the Kübelwagen in most technical specifications. It was a better answer to the question, what vehicle can keep an army mobile in a global war of attrition? That question, and its answer, defined the conflict's outcome as much as any battle or campaign. The Wehrmacht couldn't replace what it lost. The American army could. When a jeep broke down or was destroyed, another one was already on a transport ship heading overseas. When a Kübelwagen failed, German mechanics cannibalized other vehicles, waited for parts that might never arrive, or simply did without. Mobility died one vehicle at a time, and with it, the ability to fight effectively. Today, restored jeeps appear in military vehicle shows and museums worldwide. They're popular with collectors, valued for their simplicity and historical significance. Some are maintained in running condition by enthusiasts who appreciate the basic engineering and straightforward mechanics. You can work on a jeep with ordinary tools and moderate mechanical knowledge. That was true in 1944, and it remains true today. The design's fundamental rightness has endured. Meanwhile, Kübelwagens are rare collectibles, their values driven by scarcity. Only a few thousand survive worldwide. They're admired for their clever design, their efficiency, their connection to German engineering tradition. But they exist as artifacts, reminders of a road not taken, of a war fought with insufficient industrial capacity behind beautiful machines. The men who drove both vehicles, who compared them under combat conditions, who lived with their respective strengths and weaknesses, reached a consensus over the years. The Kübelwagen might have been the better designed vehicle, but the Jeep was the better war machine, and in war, that distinction matters more than anything else. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.